She didn't make a scene at her own anniversary dinner. She just left in silence and took everything. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. That was what hit Imani Virel hardest, not the woman sitting 3 chairs down from her, not the way Mujin's mother refilled that woman's wine glass before she refilled Imani's, not even the careful, practiced way the entire Seo family pretended this was normal. What broke something open inside Imani's chest that October night was the way her husband of 13 years looked across the candlelit table and held eye contact with her for exactly 2 seconds before glancing away, calm, unbothered, almost bored, as if Imani's presence at her own anniversary dinner was the mildly inconvenient part of the evening. She had built a company that carried his name. She had spent 13 years making him look like the kind of man who deserved to stand beside her. And he had spent that same time planning his replacement. If you've ever sat across from someone who once meant everything to you and realized quietly, without drama, that you were already gone to them, then you already know what Imani felt in that moment. Question isn't whether she survived it. The question is what a woman like that does next. If this story already has your attention, subscribe to this channel right now and don't leave before the ending, because what Imani does in the final part is something most people would never have the nerve to attempt. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The reservation had been Imani's idea. She'd made it 6 weeks in advance at Callaway's, a private restaurant on the Upper East Side that didn't advertise, didn't appear on any food review site, and didn't take reservations from people whose names they didn't already know. Imani had been going there since she was 31, back when she was still hungry enough to eat at the bar alone and sketch-building elevations on cocktail napkins. The maitre d', a silver-haired Haitian man named Georges, had watched her go from bar stool to corner table over a decade, had watched the company grow from 2 employees to 63. He greeted her the way old friends greet each other, with a specific kind of quiet warmth that doesn't require performance. Mrs. Seo, Georges held the door. We've prepared the private room as you requested. Thank you, Georges. She handed him her coat. Is my husband's party already seated? Pause. Brief. The kind of pause a trained professional learns to make invisible. Mr. Seo and his guests arrived approximately 20 minutes ago. Guests. Plural. Imani hadn't said anything about guests. She had booked a table for 2. Anniversary dinner. 13 years. She'd been deliberate about the number 13, was not a number most people want to celebrate, but Imani had always been the kind of woman who decided for herself what was worth marking. She'd even chosen the dress weeks ago, midnight blue, structured at the shoulders, the kind of garment that communicated competence and beauty simultaneously without working too hard at either. She'd worn her hair pulled back the way Mujin used to say he loved, before he'd stopped noticing her hair at all. She followed Georges down the narrow corridor toward the private room. Through the frosted glass panel beside the door, she could make out the warm amber glow of candlelight and the soft acoustic blur of multiple conversations already underway. She counted shaped silhouettes, really, and her brain did the arithmetic before her emotions had the chance to interfere. More than 2 people. She pushed open the door. 8 place settings. The table had been extended, the original intimate arrangement for 2 replaced with a full rectangular configuration that could seat 10. Mujin sat at the far end. His mother, Seo Hai, 71, occupied the chair to his right, her silver hair set immaculately, her expression carrying the particular brand of practiced pleasantness that wealthy Korean matriarchs deploy when they have already decided how they feel about a room. Mujin's younger brother, Seo, sat beside her with his wife, Chae-young, who was studying her menu with an intensity that suggested she had decided not to look up when Imani entered. There were 2 other people at the table whose names Imani didn't immediately process. And then there was Han Ye-rim, 34 years old. Black dress, conservative cut, pearl earrings that probably cost more than the dress. Dark hair worn down, falling past her collarbone. She was seated directly to Mujin's left, and she was laughing at something Jian Wu had just said, the kind of relaxed, unself-conscious laugh that only happens when you feel completely at home somewhere. Mujin looked up. His eyes found Imani in the doorway, and for one fraction of a second that Imani would replay. For weeks afterward, she watched him make a decision. She watched the calculation happen behind his face. She watched him choose ease over honesty, comfort over courage, his own convenience over the 13 years she'd given him. He smiled. Imani, he stood. Come sit. We were just getting started. She walked in. Later, people would ask her how she did it. How she sat down at that table, accepted the menu Georges offered her, ordered sparkling water, and proceeded to spend the next 90 minutes eating a 3-course dinner as though the evening were completely unremarkable. They'd ask if she'd known beforehand. They'd ask if she'd been prepared. The honest answer was that she'd been preparing for approximately 6 weeks from the first time she'd noticed the specific way Mujin angled his phone screen away from her, not quickly, the way guilty people do when they're startled, but slowly, almost lazily, the way people do when they've decided you're no longer a threat worth managing carefully. But knowing something intellectually and sitting across from its face at your own anniversary dinner are two entirely different categories of experience, and Imani had not been prepared for the face. Yi Rim was not a villain. That was the thing. Nobody tells you about these situations. The other woman is often just a person. And that ordinariness makes everything worse, because it means your husband didn't leave you for something extraordinary. He left you for something available. Yi Rim was polite. She spoke with a slight accent Korean, educated, probably Seoul National or Yonsei, possibly international postgraduate. Her English was precise. She referenced an investment portfolio Mujin had apparently introduced her to. She complimented the restaurant. When Haiwan spoke to her, she responded with the particular filial deference that Korean daughters-in-law are expected to perform: the careful posture, the measured eye contact, the refusal to interrupt. Haiwan responded with warmth, not the cold, conditional warmth she'd always reserved for Imani. Real warmth, familiar warmth, the warmth of someone welcoming home a person they'd chosen. Imani cut her sea bass into precise, even pieces and watched 13 years rearrange itself into a shape she hadn't seen before. Mujin had introduced Yi Rim as a business associate. That word associate was one of the most spectacular lies she'd ever heard him tell, and Imani had audited enough of his business to understand the range of his capacity for fiction. Yi Rim was not a business associate. She was the woman his family had already absorbed into itself. She was the woman who sat at that table, with the ease of someone who had been sitting there, in her imagination at least, for long enough. The furniture no longer felt borrowed. And Mujin, her husband, the man who had stood in a ceremony 13 years ago and said specific words to her in front of people, they both knew had arranged this dinner, or at minimum had permitted it to happen, and had apparently decided that the most appropriate way to handle the situation was to serve Imani a 3-course meal alongside her own replacement and call it an anniversary. She excused herself after the main course, not dramatically. She folded her napkin. She thanked the table for a pleasant evening. She said she had an early meeting and needed to get her rest. She said this to no one in particular because addressing it to Mujin would have required something she wasn't willing to give the room visible pain. Mujin's eyes tracked her as she rose. He was looking for something specific, the tremor in her hands, the brightness behind her eyes that precedes tears, the slight change in breathing that people trained in control can't quite suppress when they've been devastated. He was looking for the signal that would tell him she was broken, and that the situation was therefore manageable, that she'd cry and accuse and exhaust herself and eventually collapse into the predictable pattern of a woman who has been wronged and doesn't know what to do with it. He found none of those things. Imani smoothed her midnight blue dress, picked up her evening bag, and looked at him with an expression he couldn't name, not anger, not grief, not contempt. Something quieter than all three. Something that, if he'd been paying closer attention to her for the past 13 years, he might have recognized as the same expression she wore at the start of every major negotiation. Happy anniversary, Mujin. She walked out. Georges was waiting near the entrance. He had her coat ready. His eyes asked a question he was far too professional to voice. "Thank you for the evening, Georges," she said. "The sea base was exceptional." "Of course, Mrs. CO." He paused, holding the door. "Drive carefully." The October air hit her face, and she kept walking. She didn't go home. She knew with the particular clarity that only arrives after a long-anticipated event finally occurs, that going home meant going to his home, the penthouse on East 72nd, that he'd purchased 3 years into their marriage, with the logic that a man of his standing required a certain kind of address. It was his address, his furniture selections, his art, his territorial blueprint imposed over a shared space until Imani's preferences had quietly retreated to her home office. And her drafting table, and a small collection of books stacked on her nightstand that he'd never once asked about. She drove to her office instead. Virel Meridian Design occupied the 14th and 15th floors of a glass-sided building in Midtown that Imani had selected herself, had negotiated the lease for herself, had redesigned the interior of herself on a weekend, when Mujin was in Seoul, and she had the freedom to make decisions without referencing his taste. The building's exterior had 3 horizontal bands of steel framing that created a visual rhythm she'd found immediately appealing, the kind of structural honesty she valued in architecture and had stopped expecting from people. She used her keycard, rode the elevator alone, walked through the darkened open floor to her private office at the southeast corner. The windows gave her Manhattan. She stood there for a long time without turning on any lights. She was still holding her evening bag. She was still wearing the midnight blue dress. Somewhere below, the city continued its completely indifferent business, and Imani looked out at it and did something she almost never permitted herself. She let herself feel it, all of it, the specific humiliation of that table. High One's warmth toward another woman. Jian Wu and his wife already embedded in the fiction of the new arrangement. The way Yi Rim had laughed, the way Mujin had smiled at her in the doorway, as though she were a guest he was glad to accommodate. The 13 years of dinners, of travel, of conversations, of the particular loneliness of lying beside a man who has decided you are furniture. Stood there and felt all of it, until it passed through her, the way weather passes, arriving with force, moving through the body, and then clearing. When it was done, she exhaled. She set her evening bag on her desk, sat down in the drafting chair, and pulled up the operational file she'd been quietly building for the past 6 weeks. Financial records, client contracts, capital contribution history, revenue attributable by relationship source, intellectual property registrations. She'd started the file the week after she noticed the phone screen. Not because she'd been certain. She'd started it because she was the kind of woman who prepared, and she'd learned 13 years preparation of her life, where she'd never made a catastrophic error. She was 3 pages into the revenue attribution summary when her phone lit up on the desk. Mujin. She looked at his name on the screen for 4 full rings. Then she set the phone face down and kept reading. By 2 in the morning, she'd identified the names she needed. Danica Rourke, she'd heard the name twice in the past year from separate sources, both times in the context of women who had walked out of complicated marriages with everything that was rightfully theirs. Rourke had a reputation for methodical devastation conducted entirely within the law, which was the least kind of devastation Imani had ever been interested in. She wrote down the name. Then she closed the file, turned off her desk lamp, and looked out at Manhattan one more time. She hadn't defeated anything yet. She hadn't won anything. The table at Calloway's was still exactly what it had been 2 hours ago: her husband, his mistress, his family. And 8 place settings arranged to tell Imani something that the people at that table apparently believed she was too frightened or too dependent to act on. They did not know what she had already started building in the dark. She thought about Mujin not with hatred, which would have been easier, but with something closer to forensic clarity. She thought about the version of him she'd married at 31, before the organization expanded its New York operations, before Seoul became a second headquarters, before the specific kind of absolute authority that criminal power provides had slowly calcified his capacity for anything resembling ordinary human accountability. She had watched that process happen over a decade and had told herself, repeatedly, that it was the business pressure, the cultural expectations, the weight of what he carried. She had constructed increasingly elaborate explanations for his increasing absence. She had done him the profound disservice of making excuses for a man who never asked for them, because a man who never asks for excuses is a man who has already decided he doesn't require your forgiveness. She picked up her bag and walked back to the elevator. In the lobby, the overnight security guard, a broad-shouldered Dominican man named Felix, who'd worked the building for 4 years, looked up from his desk. Late night, Ms. Virel. She noticed he'd used her name. Her actual name, not Mrs. C.O. Productive one, though, she said. Good night, Felix. Good night. You get home safe. She drove home through light traffic, and somewhere across the Queensboro Bridge, she thought about the firm not abstractly, but specifically. The Hartwell Cultural Center commission they'd just signed, the hotel project in development, the 41 people currently employed by a company that existed, because she had worked 17-hour days in her early 30s when Mujean's connections had opened doors that her talent then refused to let close. She thought about whose company it actually was. Not in the legal, technical, registered document sense, she understood that architecture clearly enough. She meant the other kind of ownership, the kind that comes from creation. The kind that cannot be transferred or renegotiated because it lives inside the work itself. She pulled into the underground garage of the penthouse. Mujean was awake. She could see the light under the study door. She walked past it without slowing, changed out of the midnight blue dress, washed her face, and got into bed. She was asleep within 8 minutes. Mujean did not come in. She did not wait for him. In the morning, she made coffee, his too, because she was not yet ready to change anything visible, not until she understood the full shape of what she was doing. And she sat at the kitchen island and read her emails while he moved through his morning routine on the other side of the apartment. He emerged dressed for the office, and there was a moment where they occupied the kitchens and simultaneously, and the silence between them had a particular quality, not comfortable silence, not hostile silence, but the silence of two people waiting to see who would be the first to acknowledge what was different. Neither of them did. He took his coffee. He checked his phone. He told her he had a late dinner downtown. She said, I have a site visit in Brooklyn. Probably be home late myself. He nodded. He left. Imani finished her coffee, rinsed both mugs, his and hers, and put them in the drying rack side by side. Then she picked up her phone and called Danica Rourke's office. The assistant who answered was efficient and direct, which told Imani something useful about the attorney before she'd spoken to her. I'd like to schedule a consultation, Imani said. My name is Imani Virel. Tell Ms. Rourke it's a corporate divorce matter, and that the business asset component is the primary focus. This week, if she has availability. I can come any morning before 9. The assistant put her on a brief hold. Ms. Rourke has a 7:30 Thursday morning, she said when she returned. I'll take it. She hung up, put her phone in her bag, and picked up her architectural portfolio from the kitchen island. She had a meeting in 40 minutes with a developer, interested in the Brooklyn Commission, a man who'd come to her specifically, who'd said he wanted Imani Virel's firm, and no other, who had seen the Ashford building she'd designed 3 years ago, and had been tracking her work since. Her work, not CO Meridian, not the family name, not the organization. Her work. She took the elevator down, nodded to the morning doorman, and stepped out into the October air. The city was doing what it always did, moving without waiting for anyone to catch up. Imani walked toward it. She was already moving faster. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of October sky that sits low over Manhattan and makes the buildings look like they're holding up something heavy. Imani was already inside the lobby of Rourke & Associates at 7:14, 16 minutes early, because she had never once been late to anything that mattered, and she wasn't going to start now. The office was on the 22nd floor of a building on Lexington, and it looked nothing like the aggressive power display law firms. Mujean used no museum-quality art, no leather the color of old money, no floor-to-ceiling views arranged to remind visitors of their smallness. Rourke's space was clean and dense. Floor-to-ceiling shelving, case files, organized with a system that was clearly personal and clearly functional, a conference table scarred at one corner from what looked like years of hard use. The only personal item visible was a framed photograph behind the main desk, not a family portrait, but a black and white print of a woman mid-stride, crossing a crosswalk, head down, coat open, going somewhere fast. No frame, just glass over the print, pinned directly to the wall. Imani liked that immediately. Danica Rourke walked in at exactly 7:30. No apology for the hour, no performative warmth. She was 51, compact, with the kind of efficient physical presence that suggested she'd long ago made peace with being underestimated by people who would later regret it. She set a legal pad on the table, uncapped a pen, and sat down. Virel Meridian Design, she said. Not a question. She'd already done her reading. You co-founded it. You want out of the marriage, and the business asset division is where you expect the fight. The business asset division is where the fight will be most interesting, Imani said. Because the numbers don't support his position, and he doesn't know yet that I've been looking at them. Rourke wrote something. How long have you been building documentation? 6 weeks. What triggered it? A phone screen. Rourke looked up. Just the phone? The phone confirmed a pattern that had been developing for approximately 8 months. I prefer to act on patterns rather than individual incidents. Individual incidents can be explained. Patterns don't require explanation. Something shifted slightly in Rourke's expression, not quite admiration, but professional recognition, the way one careful person identifies another. Tell me about his stake in the company. Imani opened the portfolio she'd brought. Organized by category, founding documents, capital contribution records, client acquisition logs, cross-referenced to relationship source, revenue history, intellectual property registration, award and industry recognition documentation. Rourke went through it without speaking for 11 minutes. When she set the last page down, she didn't say anything immediately. She turned her pen slowly between two fingers, which Imani would later recognize as the thing she did when she was constructing an argument in real time. He's going to claim that his network created the company's early market access, Rourke said. He did. I've acknowledged that in my own records. His connections opened the first 4 major client relationships. How many active contracts currently trace back to those original relationships? 1. And that client has renewed entirely on the basis of our design work for the past 9 years. The original introduction is irrelevant to why they stay. Can you prove that? I have 11 years of renewal correspondence, 6 letters of reference they've provided to other prospective clients, and a recorded conversation with their COO in which he specifically cited 3 completed projects by name as his reasons for continued engagement. She paused. None of those projects involved Mujin in any operational capacity. Rourke put her pen down. Imani, she said, I take about 40% of the cases that come through that door. The ones I don't take, I send somewhere competent, but not here. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what I'm about to say carries weight. This is one of the strongest asset position cases I've reviewed in 6 years. Imani didn't smile. I know. He's going to come at you with everything. I know that too. His attorneys will be aggressive. Possibly aggressive in ways that go beyond the legal process. Imani held her gaze. I've spent 13 years building something meaningful while living inside that man's world. I understand what his version of aggressive looks like. Rourke picked her pen back up. Then let's get to work. They met for 2 hours that first morning. They met again the following Tuesday. By the second week of November, they had reconstructed, categorized, and legally indexed 13 years of business history into a document architecture that was, Rourke told her with a kind of flat professional satisfaction, essentially unassailable. Imani had always been good at documentation. Architects live and die by their records. Every revision, every specification change, every client communication logged and cross-referenced, because the building that gets constructed is only as defensible as the paper trail behind it. She'd applied that same discipline to her marriage without ever that same discipline deciding to, and now that discipline had produced something Mujin's attorneys were going to find genuinely unpleasant. At home, nothing changed. Coffee in the morning, normal hours. Pleasant, empty conversation about schedules and logistics. Mujin seemed to interpret her continued steadiness as either ignorance or acceptance, and either way he appeared to find it convenient. He was making his own arrangements. She could feel them happening in the peripheral spaces of their shared life. The phone calls taken his car, the dinner invitations to events she wasn't mentioned for, the gradual redistribution of his personal items toward one side of the closet, as though preparing for a move he hadn't announced. She noticed all of it. She documented none of it, because it was irrelevant. Personal behavior in a marriage didn't interest Danica Rourke. What interested Danica Rourke was the money, the equity, and the paper. The paper told the real story. The third week of November, Mujin came home from a meeting in a mood she recognized, not the cold, controlled mood of a man managing his criminal business, but the specific, brittle energy of a man who had been told something he hadn't expected. He moved through the kitchen faster than usual, poured a drink without offering her one, and stood at the window looking out at the city with his jaw set at the angle that meant he was recalculating something. Imani was at the kitchen island, reviewing contractor submittals for the Hartwell project. She did not look up. He said, "I heard you had a meeting with someone from Rourke's office." Turned a page. "I have meetings with a lot of people." "Danica Rourke," he said. "Corporate divorce." She looked up then, because looking up was normal, and not looking up would have communicated something she wasn't ready to reveal. She met his eyes across the kitchen. "You have sources everywhere," she said. "That's always been true." "Imani, I'm not going to discuss it tonight, Mujin. I have a project deadline." He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, which was faster than she'd anticipated, and he set his drink down on the island hard enough that a small amount sloshed over the rim. Not threatening, Mujin had never been physically threatening to her, and she understood that about him clearly. His violence had always been organizational, conducted at remove through people who handled the physical requirements of his business. But the gesture was meant to communicate urgency, to make her feel the weight of his attention. She looked at the spilled drink. Then she looked at him. "You're going to want to wipe that up," she said. "The marble stains." Something moved behind his eyes. Frustration, certainly. But also the beginning of something else, something that looked almost like the first faint registration of an opponent. He wiped up the spill with a kitchen towel. He set the towel down carefully. "We need to talk," he said. "Properly. Not through attorneys." "Your attorneys called my attorneys," she said. "That's not how I started this conversation." "That was you." "I didn't." He stopped, pressed 2 fingers to his temple. "I haven't made any formal moves yet." "I know." She closed her submittal folder. "But you will. And when you do, Danica will be ready, and I'll let them handle it, because that's what I'm paying her for." She picked up her coffee. "Is there something else, or can I get back to work?" He stared at her for a long moment. The Mujin she'd married, the younger, hungrier version who'd had to earn his position rather than simply inhabit it, might have said something honest in that moment. Might have cut through the performance and told her something true. But that man had spent 15 years becoming the chairman of Seo Meridian Holdings and the invisible head of an organization that responded to his decisions without question. And somewhere in that process, he'd lost fluency in honesty, the way people lose fluency in languages they stop speaking. He left the kitchen. She opened her folder again. Her hands were completely steady. The formal notification arrived the 2nd week of December, not through Mujin directly, but through a letter delivered to Rourke's office from a firm called Bay, Sa, and 3 names she didn't recognize. Rourke called her the same afternoon. "They've engaged Besa," Rourke said. "You know them?" "No, corporate, not family law." Which means he's approaching this as a business dissolution rather than a divorce. That tells us 2 things. He's worried about the asset question, and he's planning to argue the company as a joint enterprise rather than your individual creative work. A brief pause. He's going to come at the co-founding narrative hard. Let him. Imani Baisu is extremely good. I want you prepared for this to get ugly before it gets clean. Danica. She was in her car, parked outside the Brooklyn site she'd spent the afternoon reviewing. The sky had gone dark early, and the streetlights made the wet pavement look like hammered tin. "I've been in that man's world for 13 years. I have sat across tables from people who were planning things I won't describe. I've watched him handle problems I will never publicly acknowledge. I know what ugly looks like. Basa's version of ugly is paperwork. I can manage paperwork, silence on the line. All right, Rourke said. Then here's what we do first. The holiday season moved through their apartment like something uninvited. Mujin spent Christmas in Seoul business, he said, and she didn't ask about Yirim because she had stopped caring about Yirim in the way she'd thought she would. She'd expected jealousy to be the main texture of this period. Instead, the dominant feeling was something closer to spaciousness, the particular sensation of a room after the furniture's been moved out, when you realize how much space you'd been working around without knowing it. She spent Christmas morning at the office, then had dinner with Everett Quaid and his husband, Marcus, at their apartment in Park Slope. Everett Quaid was 55, one of the most technically gifted structural architects Imani had ever known, and the person she trusted most professionally in the world. He joined Varel Meridian in its second year, when the firm had 8 employees and 2 major active projects, and Imani was working hours that would have alarmed a medical professional. He'd never fully liked Mujin, not with hostility, but with the quiet skepticism of a person who understood construction at the molecular level, and therefore applied the same scrutiny to things that claimed more structural integrity than they actually possessed. Over dinner, he said, "You look different." She reached for her water. Different how? Less managed. He considered this. Like you're not carrying something heavy. You look lighter. Marcus, who was a teen, was a pediatric surgeon, had the specific emotional intelligence of someone who is working life with frightened parents, looked between them and said nothing. "I've been thinking about the firm," Imani said. Everett set down his fork. "Specifically," she said, "about what it's called. And what it should be called." The table went quiet in a particular way, the kind of quiet that arrives when something important is about to be said and everyone present understands it. "The CO name," Everett said carefully. "His participation has been ceremonial for at least 4 years. Decorative. His name on the letterhead serves one function now. It tells a certain category of client that there's an organization behind the firm that won't be inconvenienced." She met Everett's eyes. "But that arrangement has costs. I've been paying without pricing them correctly." "What do you want to do?" "I want to restructure. I want a new operating agreement. I want his name removed from the entity entirely, and the company reestablished under principals who actually run it." Everett was quiet for a long moment. He was running structural calculations. She knew not of buildings, but of consequences. "If you do that while the divorce is active," he began. "Danica's already mapping it. It's complex, but it's clean. His equity interest is the negotiating point, not the name rights. The name was never formally transferred to him. He was listed as co-founder by professional courtesy, not legal instrument. He won't see it that way. He can see it however he wants. What he can see and what he can prove are going to turn out to be very different things." Everett picked up his fork again. He cut a piece of roast, chewed it, set the fork down. He was doing the thing he always did when he'd made a decision, eating the next bite before confirming it, as though giving himself one last ordinary moment before stepping off the edge. "It should have been your name all along," he said. "Yours and mine. That's what it should have been from the start." Imani looked at him across the table. She'd been waiting, she realized, for someone to say that out loud. Not for the validation she'd never needed his or anyone else's approval to understand the value of her own work. But there was something. In hearing it spoken, in the specific plainness of the statement from the one person who had been present for all 13 years of the building of the thing, that made it real in a new way. "Then that's what it's going to be," she said. January came in wet and brutal, and with it came Mujin's first formal negotiating position, delivered through Bei Su in a document that Rourke forwarded to Imani with a 2-word text message. "Read this." She read it in her office on a Saturday morning, sitting at her drafting table in running clothes, because she'd gone out at 6:30 and come back and hadn't changed because she'd wanted to keep moving, and sometimes the drafting table was the fastest way to stay in motion. The document claimed that CO Meridian Holdings had provided not merely personal network access during the firm's founding years, but ongoing institutional support in the form of organizational relationships, financial guarantees, and business infrastructure that had materially contributed to the firm's growth through at least year 7. It claimed that Mujin's role as co-founder was more than ceremonial, that his presence and name had served as a continuous form of market credibility, without which specific categories of client would not have engaged. It claimed a 43% equity interest. 43%. Imani read it twice. Then she called Rourke. "I've seen it," Rourke said before she could speak. 43%. It's an opening position. It's aggressive. It's also where they expect us to panic and counter at 35 and split the difference at 38 or 39. Rourke's voice was completely level. "We're not doing that. What are we doing? We're pulling their claim on ongoing institutional support apart at the thread level. I need you in here Monday morning with every document that shows decision-making authority on any project above $500,000 for the past 13 years. Every email chain, every meeting record, every revision approval, every client communication. I want to map exactly where his fingerprints are and are not. And then I want to show Bei Su what 43% of operational contribution actually looks like when you document it. I have all of that. I know you do, Monday, 7:30. She hung up. Outside her office window, Midtown moved through its Saturday rhythms slower than weekdays, but never actually slow. She watched a yellow cab cut across 3 lanes of traffic on 6th Avenue with the casual ferocities of something that had been navigating that particular stretch of road for decades. She thought about Mujin's 43%. She thought about the specific audacity of that number, not 30, not 25, which might have reflected something defensible, but 43, a number clearly designed to communicate maximum territorial claim and see how far it landed. It was how he negotiated everything, announce an extreme position and let other people collapse towards the center. It had worked for him, consistently, in business and in the organization, for long enough that he'd apparently forgotten it required the other party to be willing to collapse. She opened her laptop and pulled up the master documentation file. She had 41 folders. Each one represented a year, a project category, a client relationship, or a legal instrument. She'd built it the way she built buildings, starting with the foundation, working up, cross-checking every load-bearing element, never trusting anything that couldn't prove its own structural integrity. She started pulling the files Rourke needed, organizing them by the taxonomy they'd developed together, and she worked for 4 hours without stopping, without eating, without doing anything except the specific and focused work of dismantling a 43% claim with the precision of someone who had spent her professional life understanding exactly how things fall apart and exactly where the stress fractures begin. At 2 in the afternoon, her phone rang. Not Rourke. Not Mujin, Seo Haiwan. Imani looked at the name on the screen. She thought about the anniversary dinner. She thought about the way Haiwan had refilled Yi Rim's wineglass. She thought about the warmth, real warmth, familiar warmth that she'd never once directed at Imani with that kind of ease. She answered. Haiwan Si. She used the respectful form deliberately, the way she'd been trained to early in the marriage, holding the register of deference even now, because she'd already decided that nothing about this conversation was going to give the older woman any information she didn't already have. Imani. Haiwan's English was formal and precise, learned from tutors rather than immersion, and she deployed it with a careful emphasis of someone who understood that choosing to speak in your interlocutor's language is itself a form of communication. I think we should speak before this becomes too complicated. It's already complicated, Haiwan Si. It doesn't need to be more so. A pause. The family has always respected what you've built with the company. No one is disputing your professional contribution. Imani set down her pen very carefully. The document your son's attorneys delivered to my attorney on Friday is disputing exactly that. That is the attorneys. Attorneys make positions aggressive. It is what they do. I'm speaking to you directly, as I have always preferred. Then speak directly. Another pause, longer this time. When Haiwan spoke again, the register had shifted slightly, not softer, but more candid. It's the way a person speaks when they've decided. The performance is costing more than it's worth. Mujin made choices that were not respectful to you. I am aware of this. I am not calling to defend those choices. She paused again. I am calling to ask you not to destroy what the CO name represents in this process. There are things connected to that name that go beyond a divorce. Things that require discretion. There it was. Imani had expected something like this, but not this early, and not from Haiwan directly. The organization rarely made direct contact with people outside its structure unless it had determined that subtlety wasn't producing results. The fact that Mujin's mother was on her phone, making a quiet appeal to discretion, told Imani that the restructuring plan, the removal of the SEO name from the company, had somehow reached people who understood what the legitimate business cover represented. Imani, I'm going to offer you something I rarely give anyone, which is a completely honest answer. I have no interest in the parts of this situation that don't concern me legally. I am not going to cooperate with your son's attorney's position, and I am going to pursue the full restructuring of my company as my attorneys advise. But I am also not going to involve myself in anything outside that scope. She let that settle for exactly 2 seconds. I am giving you 13 years of discretion as a parting gift. What you do with it is your business. The line was quiet for long enough that Imani thought Haiwan might have ended the call. Then you were always more capable than he deserved. I know, Imani said. That's why I'm not angry. Goodbye, Haiwansi. She ended the call. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand, feeling the particular weight of what had just happened, not just the call, but the entirety of the ground that had shifted since October. She thought about Mujin, about what the call meant for his understanding of her position, about how long it would take for him to learn that his mother had made direct contact, and what his response would be. She thought about the 43% claim in the context of an organization that needed its legitimate makeup to remain intact. She thought about leverage. And then she picked up her pen, opened the next folder in her documentation system, and went back to work, because the building wasn't finished, and she didn't stop working on things that weren't finished. Call from Mujin came 4 hours later at 6:17 in the evening. She was still at the drafting table. She answered. My mother called you, he said. Not a question. His voice had the specific texture of controlled anger, not loud, never loud, but compressed, the way pressure sounds when something is containing it that might not hold. She did. What did she say to you? She asked for discretion. Silence. Imani. He said her name the way he used to say it before the organization consumed everything with actual weight, actual presence, as though the word meant something specific to him. We need to end this reasonably, for both of us. 43% is not a number we're discussing. Then what numbers? Mujin. She kept her voice completely even. You sat me down at that table in October and introduced me to the woman you've been building a life with. In front of your family. At a dinner I arranged. For our anniversary. She paused. You made a choice. I've made mine. Let the attorneys handle the numbers. That's what they're for. If you remove my name from that company. Stop. Her voice didn't change in volume, but something in it shifted, became precise in the way a structural calculation becomes precise. No extra weight. No ornamentation, just the load-bearing truth. Don't tell me what happens if I remove your name. You don't have a name in that company. You have a credit I extended to you 13 years ago out of love and professional generosity, and it was always mine to extend and mine to withdraw. You know that. Your attorneys know that. That's why the document they sent me is 43% of a claim they can't actually prove. The silence this time was different. It had the quality of something cracking, not shattering, not yet but developing a fracture that would spread. I didn't expect this from you, he said, and he meant it, which was the most honest thing he'd said to her in possibly 2 years. I know, she said. That was your second mistake. She ended the call. She set the phone face down on the drafting table and looked at the open folder in front of her client correspondence from year 4 of the company. A letter from a developer named Holloway, who'd been introduced to them through a CO Meridian contact, and who had gone on to commission 4 additional projects, all of which he'd initiated by calling Imani directly on her cell phone, because she was the person he trusted. She photographed the letter with her phone and sent it to Rourke with a single line of text for the Holloway file. This one matters. Then she got up, finally changed out of her running clothes, made herself a bowl of rice and vegetables she barely tasted, and sat at her kitchen window, watching the city rearrange its lights. The first mistake had been the anniversary dinner. The second had been underestimating the silence. A sound like green wood splitting, and the third the one neither Mujin nor his attorney nor understood, Enners yet, so was assuming, that the woman who had built Virel Meridian Design had done so without knowing, from the very beginning, exactly whose hands had built it, and exactly what those hands were capable of doing when they finally stopped holding something that didn't deserve to be held. She was already gone. She just hadn't let him see the door close yet. The restructuring documents landed on Vesu's desk on a Tuesday morning in the second week of February, and Imani knew the exact moment they arrived because Rourke called her at 9:47 with a sound in her voice that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it the particular tone of a person watching a carefully constructed argument begin to perform exactly as designed. They received the filing, Rourke said, and their assistant called mine within 20 minutes. They want an emergency mediation session, this week if possible. Imani was standing at the window of her office, watching a delivery truck attempt a 3-point turn on a street that wasn't wide enough for it. The driver was committed despite all available evidence suggesting he should reverse course entirely. She found it briefly instructive. "Tell them we're available Thursday," she said. "Morning only. I have a site visit in the afternoon I won't reschedule." "That site visit is real, or is it tactical?" "Both." Rourke made a sound that was as close to a laugh as she typically produced during business hours. "Thursday morning. I'll confirm." The restructuring filing had done exactly what they'd designed it to do. It separated the question of Mujin's equity interest from the question of his name rights, treating them as legally distinct issues that required individual resolution. His equity claim, whatever number Besu eventually landed on, was a financial negotiation. The name was not. The name, as Imani's documentation demonstrated with systematic clarity, had never been formally assigned to him through any legal instrument. It had been extended as a professional courtesy in the founding documents, listed under a category of attribution that carried no ownership weight under New York business law. Besu had apparently not identified this distinction before the filing arrived. Imani had identified it in the first week of her work with Rourke, and she had spent the following 8 weeks building a case around it with the same structural logic she applied to every load-bearing problem. Find the point where the weight actually rests, and demonstrate that the thing claiming to support it is decorative. She moved away from the window and sat at her drafting table, pulling up the Hartwell Cultural Center file. The steel fabrication submittals had overnight, and she wanted to review the connection details before her afternoon site visit. There was a moment in every project where the structure either proved its own logic or revealed the compromise. Someone had made in an earlier phase, and she'd learned in 20 years of practice to catch those moments on paper rather than on site, because fixing them on paper cost time and fixing them in steel cost everything. She worked for 3 hours without interruption. At 12:30, her assistant, a methodical young woman named Priya, who had the useful quality of delivering bad news in the same register as good news, knocked on the open office door. "There's a Marcus Holloway on line 2, Priya said. "He says it's personal and that you'd know what it's regarding." Imani looked up from the submittal drawings. Marcus Holloway was not the developer she worked with. Marcus Holloway was Everett's husband, the pediatric surgeon from the Park Slope Christmas dinner, and the specific phrasing "personal" you'd know meant that Everett had asked him to make this call rather than making it himself, which meant the content of the call was something Everett had decided needed distance from his professional relationship with her. That was a specific and unsettling pattern of behavior from a man who communicated directly about everything. "Put him through," she said. The line clicked. "Imani." Marcus's voice was careful, in the way surgeons' voices are careful calibrated, not to conceal emotion, but to manage the speed at which information lands. Marcus. What happened? Everett is fine, he said immediately, because he understood what the phrasing of her question meant. He's not hurt. But something happened this morning, and he asked me to call you, because he's at the office, and he didn't want to call from there. What happened at the office? A brief pause. The kind that means the speaker is determining not what to say but how. 2 men came to see him this morning, before anyone else arrived. They were there when he got in at 7. They said they were from CO Meridian. They didn't threaten him. Those were his exact words to me. Imani, he said they were very polite, but they asked him specific questions about the restructuring filing, about his role in it, about whether he understood what he was agreeing to by co-signing it. Imani set her pen down on the drawing sheet. They knew about the filing, she said. They knew about the filing. They knew Everett's name was on it. They knew it had been submitted Tuesday morning, and they apparently knew which coffee place he stops at on the way in, because they were waiting in the lobby of that building, not the firm. She was quiet for 4 seconds, which was the amount of time it took her to understand the specific geometry of what she was hearing. The filing was public record, but had been submitted less than 48 hours ago. The coffee place was a detail that required either surveillance or a source inside her operation, someone who knew Everett's routine, someone with access to information about the people connected to her professional life. Did they say anything else? They said, and Everett wrote this down because he wanted to be accurate. They said, Mr. Quaid, it would be unfortunate if this process became complicated for everyone involved. And then they thanked him for his time and left. Amansi stood up from her drafting table. She walked to her office window, not to look at anything, but because standing still was suddenly not possible. Below, the delivery truck from earlier was gone. The street was completely normal pedestrians, cabs, a woman in a red coat, walking a dog the size of a small horse. The absolute normalcy of it had a briefly surreal quality, the way ordinary things look when your nervous system is processing something extraordinary. Tell Everett to go home, she said. Tell him to take the rest of today and call Rourke's office from his personal cell before he does anything else. Tell him I'm sorry, he said. To tell you he's not scared, Marcus said. He said to tell you he's angry. Tell him I know the difference and I'm grateful for it. Tell him to go home anyway. She ended the call. She stood at the window for another 30 seconds. Then she called Rourke. They sent people to Everett, she said when Rourke picked up. A silence that lasted exactly long enough to indicate the information was being processed rather than absorbed. When this morning, before business hours, they knew about the filing, they knew his name was on it, they knew his coffee routine. 2 men, polite, standard implied consequence language. Are you at your office? Yes, don't leave until I call you back. 20 minutes. Rourke called back in 14. Okay, here's where we are. This is organizational pressure, not legal pressure, which means it's operating outside the scope of what Bei Su can be held responsible for. The question is whether it constitutes intimidation of a party to a legal proceeding, which it potentially does, but proving the connection between Mujin's instruction and these men's visit is not simple. Can we use it? Carefully and not yet. Right now it's information. It tells us he's concerned enough about the restructuring to move outside the legal channels, which means the filing did exactly what we wanted. But if we try to weaponize it prematurely, we give them the opportunity to deny it, and we look reactive. Rourke paused. I want you to do one thing today. I want you to document this conversation. Time-stamped, detailed in writing. Email it to me as soon as you hang up. Don't discuss it with anyone who isn't me or your attorney of record. Everett has his own attorney now. I made 3 calls in the last 14 minutes. He'll be hearing from someone within the hour he's covered. Another pause. Imani, this is going to get harder before it gets easier. I need to know you're prepared for that. I've been prepared for that since October. She documented the conversation, emailed it to Rourke, and then sat at her desk and looked at the fabrication submittals without reading them for approximately 90 seconds, before she admitted to herself that she wasn't going to be able to focus on the text connection details for the rest of this afternoon and put the drawings aside. She thought about the coffee place. Someone knew Everett's coffee place. That level of specific quotidian knowledge about a person who was connected to her professionally, not personals, not publicly, meant either extended surveillance or an internal source. She ran through the possibilities with the systematic blankness she applied to structural analyses, refusing to let instinct drive the conclusion before the evidence warranted it. The list of people with access to routine information about the firm's principals was not long. 41 employees, roughly a dozen regular contractors and consultants, a small administrative team. She knew all of them. She'd hired most of them directly, had reviewed every hire she hadn't made personally. She'd spent 13 years building a team based on a very specific principle, competence first, but character always checked. She didn't employ people she didn't trust, and she'd been right about people often enough to develop confidence in her own reading of them. But she'd also been wrong once, significantly, and for 13 years, about the person she'd married. She picked up her phone and called a number she'd been hoping not to need. Jerome Sills was a former NYPD investigator who'd built a private security consulting practice over 15 years, primarily serving corporate clients navigating situations that existed in the productive gray zone between legal and illegal exposure. She'd met him through a client 3 years ago and had kept his number under the category of things you retain, because you hope you won't need them, and you understand is not a structural element. Imani Virel, he said when he answered. I was wondering if I'd hear from you. You knew about the filing, yes. I follow the business news around the firms I've worked adjacent to. A pause. And I heard some other things, more recently. Meaning what? Meaning there's been some quiet movement around your professional orbit in the past 3 weeks. I noticed it, and I wasn't sure whether to call. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Tell me what you noticed. Jerome told her. It took 7 minutes. By the end of those 7 minutes, Imani understood that the surveillance had not begun with the restructuring filing. It had begun, based on Jerome's assessment, approximately 6 weeks earlier, meaning it had begun almost immediately after Rourke filed the initial divorce documentation. Someone connected to Mujean's organization had been monitoring her professional contacts, her firm's administrative communications, and the movements of at least 2 of her senior staff, including Everett, for the better part of 2 months. How deep, she said when he finished. Deep enough to know your filing before it was public record. Either they have someone with access to the court system's advance filing notifications, or they have someone closer. He let that sit for a moment. I'm sorry to tell you this, Imani. I know what your firm means to you. I need you active, she said. Starting today, I need to know the scope of what they have, and I need to know if there's an internal source. That second part is going to be uncomfortable. I know. You'll need to let me operate with complete discretion. No sharing the process with anyone at the firm, including people you trust. She thought about Everett. She thought about Priya, efficient and unreadable Priya, who delivered bad news in the same tone as good. She thought about the 23 people who sat in the open studio space below her office every working day, drafting and modeling and arguing about specifications on projects that carried her name. Understood, she said. I'll start today. I'll contact you through a separate channel. I'll text you a number within the hour. Use that number only, Jerome. She paused. If it's internal, if there's someone inside, then I'll tell you before I tell anyone else, and you'll decide how to handle it. That's how this works. His voice was not unkind. You're still in control here. Don't forget that. She hung up. The afternoon site visit happened anyway, because she'd meant what she said to Rourke about not rescheduling it, and because maintaining the visible rhythm of her normal professional life was the only form of operational security she could guarantee without Jerome's assessment. She drove to Brooklyn in heavy traffic, walked the Hartwell site with her project manager, a detail-oriented young man named Cassidy who pointed out a foundation drainage issue that would require an addendum, not a crisis. Manageable. Kind of routine problem-solving that the actual work of building things produced continuously, and which Imani had always found grounding, precisely because it had nothing to do with anything except physics and water. She drove back to Manhattan in the dark. Jerome's text arrived while she was stuck in traffic on the bridge. A phone number. Nothing else. She didn't call it until she was home, sitting at her kitchen table with a glass of water she hadn't touched, because she'd wanted to be still and not moving when she received whatever came next. She called the number at 8:47. "I have preliminary findings," Jerome said. "I want to walk you through them. Go." The external monitoring was contracted through a private firm that CO Meridian has used previously for corporate intelligence. It's standard-grade surveillance communications monitoring on your firm's public channels, physical observation of principals, nothing that required illegal access at the external level. A pause. The internal piece is more complicated. She set the water glass down. "Tell me. I don't have a name yet, but I have a behavioral pattern. Someone with access to the firm's internal scheduling and senior staff communications has been exporting data to an external address on a pattern that started 6 weeks ago. It's small, carefully small, but it's consistent. Whoever it is, they're not a novice. They're taking just enough to be useful without taking enough to trigger a standard audit flag." The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator made a sound it always made, a low mechanical hum she'd lived with for 2 years, and stopped hearing. She heard it now with complete clarity, the way you suddenly hear ambient sounds when everything else has gone too still. "Can you identify the address?" It routes through 2 anonymizing layers. "I can get to the source, but it'll take another 48 to 72 hours. He paused again. "Imani, I need to tell you something, and I need you to sit with it for a moment before you respond." "Say it." The scheduling data that was exported includes the filing date for the restructuring documents. It also includes Everett Quaid's calendar entries for the past 6 weeks. His coffee location appears in a standing appointment block he set in the scheduling system 3 weeks ago. Jerome's voice was careful and direct. "Someone in your firm gave those men his morning location. It wasn't accident, and it wasn't external surveillance. Someone walked that information out the door." She didn't respond immediately. She sat with it the way he'd asked, because she understood the request not as a therapeutic suggestion, but as a tactical one. Reactive decisions made in the immediate aftermath of betrayal are structurally unsound. She knew this about construction, and she knew it about people. "How many people have access to executive calendar scheduling?" she said finally. "Based on what I can see from the outside, I'd estimate 5 to 8. But only 2 or 3 would have the access level this demonstrates." She went through the list in her mind. Priya, 2 other administrative staff, 1 IT contractor who managed the scheduling system. And her stomach moved in a way she didn't let reach her face, because there was no one in the room, but she had trained herself never to let physical responses to information happen visibly, even alone. And Cassidy, her project manager, the detail-oriented young man who had walked the Hartwell site with her this afternoon and pointed out the drainage issue with the specific earnestness of someone whose entire professional identity was built around catching what others missed. Cassidy, who had been with the firm for 14 months, who had come with impeccable references from a developer she'd trusted, who she had liked immediately, and whose work she'd promoted within his first 8 months. "Jerome," she said, "the IT contractor who manages scheduling, do you have his history with CO Meridian's network?" A pause that told her Jerome had already looked. "He did contract work for a CO Meridian subsidiary 18 months ago," Jerome said, "before he came to you. The subsidiary is a property management company. On paper, it's legitimate. In practice, it's an organizational front," she said. "I know the subsidiary." "Yes." She stood up from the kitchen table. She walked to her living room window. The Hudson was out there, dark and moving, indifferent to the specific geometry of her situation, and she stood there the way she'd stood at her office window on October night when all of this began, except that the feeling this time was different. The October feeling had been grief clarifying into purpose. This feeling was something rawer and more difficult, the specific betrayal of having built something carefully and discovered that the care itself had been used against her. 14 months. This person had been inside her firm for 14 months, and she had read him as loyal and talented, and she had promoted him. And somewhere in that 14 months, or possibly before it, possibly the entire time he had been connected to the world, she was trying to separate herself from. "I need a name," she said. not a behavioral pattern. A name, 72 hours, Jerome said, maybe less. Call me the moment you have it. Any hour. She ended the call. She stood at the window for a long time. She thought about Mujin, not the betrayal, not the anniversary dinner, not the 43% claim, but the specific mechanism of how he operated. Spent 13 years observing it, and she understood it clearly enough to build a counter-strategy against its legal dimensions. But what she hadn't fully reckoned with what she was reckoning with now, in the dark, with the Hudson move-ins silently beyond her window, was that Mujin's world didn't separate cleanly into legal and illegal. It never had. The organizational infrastructure existed in the interstices between those categories, and it operated through people who looked exactly like contractors and project managers and scheduling system administrators. She had brought the divorce into the light. He had responded by operating in the places she couldn't see. She went to her desk, not the drafting table, the writing desk she kept in the corner of her bedroom where she did her most private thinking, and she opened the notebook she'd kept since she was 27, plain black composition book she filled and replaced on a cycle that had produced 11 volumes so far. She wrote for 20 minutes, not about the investigation, not about the case, about the shape of the problem, the structural logic of it, the way a problem that appears to be about one thing is actually about the load distribution underneath. She'd been fighting a legal battle. Mujin had understood before she had that the legal battle was theater and that the actual contest was happening beneath it, in the organizational space where he had spent his entire adult life and where she had never operated and had never wanted to. She closed the notebook. She understood something now that she hadn't understood in October, or in December, or even last week when the filing had felt like a decisive move. She understood that she had been building her case on the assumption that the legal system was the primary arena. It was one arena. But Mujin occupied a different one, and that arena had different rules and different weapons. And he had just demonstrated that he was willing to use them against her professional world, against the people who worked for her, against the firm. That was the only thing she was fighting to protect. The legal strategy was correct. It would succeed. She was certain of that. But it was not sufficient. She needed to understand the full map of what was connected to the CO name inside her company, not just the IT contractor, not just whoever had exported the scheduling data, every thread, every introduced contact, every relationship that had entered her professional world through Mujin's network rather than her own. She needed the complete picture before she could cut anything safely. Because in architecture, in the actual practice of building, you cannot remove a structural element without first understanding what it's holding. Remove the wrong thing in the wrong sequence and you don't weaken the structure. You collapse it. She had 41 employees. She had to find out which ones were load-bearing walls and which ones were quietly holding up someone else's ceiling. She sat at her writing desk until 1 a.m, building the list. Jerome called at 6:43 the next morning, while she was still in running clothes, just back from the river path where she'd gone at 5:30, because she'd stopped sleeping at 5, and there was no productive use of the hour except movement. "I have the name," he said. She sat down on the floor of her entryway, back against the wall, without bothering to find a chair. "Tell me," he told her. It wasn't Cassidy, it was Priya. Efficient, methodical, delivers bad news in the same register as good news. Priya, who had worked for Imani for 3 years, and who had, according to Jerome's source trace, been connected to a SEO Meridian operational contact since before she'd applied for the position at VRL Meridian Design. Before she'd applied, she had been placed. Imani sat on the floor of her entryway with that factling. Here's its precise and terrible weight. 3 years. Not 14 months, not 6 weeks, not since the divorce filing. 3 years of access to her schedule, her correspondence, her client relationships, her internal communications, her daily rhythm. 3 years of an administrative presence so seamlessly competent that Imani had never once examined the seam. "How connected," she said. Her voice was flat and strange to her own ears. "Directly to one of his operational managers. Not a distant link. Primary contact." Jerome paused. Imani, this predates your divorce proceedings by 2 years. This was deliberate positioning inside your firm. She closed her eyes. He had known, not necessarily about the divorce. She hadn't known about the divorce 2 years ago. But he had understood 2 years before she walked out of Callaway's that she was a variable in his world that required management. That the firm she'd built was something worth monitoring. That the woman who ran it was worth having a window into. He had never been afraid of her leaving. He had been preparing for the possibility long before she had. And the worst part, the part that sat on her chest, like a structural failure she hadn't caught on the drawings, was that every preparation she'd made since October, every document she'd assembled, every meeting with Rourke, every filing, every carefully timed decision had happened within the sightline of someone who was reporting to the other side. She pressed the back of her head against the wall and looked at the ceiling. Soon. The morning light was coming through the entryway window, thin and gray, the specific light of February that doesn't commit to anything. She thought about what Priya knew. She thought about what Priya had seen. And then she thought about what Priya had not seen, what she couldn't have seen, because Imani had built certain parts of this, in places that Priya didn't have access to, in writing desks and late-night calls from personal phones and conversations in Rourke's office that no scheduling system could record. The damage was real, but it was not total. She got up off the floor. She walked to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, drank half of it, standing at the sink. She looked at her hands on the counter, steady, both of them, which she checked the way a pilot checks instruments after turbulence, not from fear, but from the operational necessity of knowing the current state of things. She called Rourke. "We have a problem," she said when Rourke answered. "And I need you to tell me how we turn it into something else." Rourke was quiet for 11 seconds after Imani finished telling her. Imani counted them. She was still standing at her kitchen sink, still in running clothes, still holding the water glass she'd emptied and then refilled without drinking. The February morning outside her window had not improved. The sky was the color of old concrete, and it sat on top of the city like something exhausted. 3 years, Rourke said finally, before she applied. Jerome traced the contact. It's a direct line to one of his operational managers, not a peripheral connection. What has she had access to? Everything administrative. My schedule, correspondence routing, client contact lists, internal meeting records, filing timelines. Imani set the glass down. She would have seen the divorce documentation requests before they left my desk. She would have known about Rourke and Associates before my first meeting with you. Another silence, shorter this time. Then he knew about the legal strategy from the beginning, Rourke said. From before the beginning, which means Besu's positions haven't been reactive. They've been responsive. Yes. Imani moved away from the sink. He's been reading our mail, Danica, the entire time. She heard Rourke exhale through her nose, not frustration, but the specific sound of a person recalibrating a map they'd believed was accurate. How much does Jerome's source confirm? Is the export trail court admissible? He says yes, with the right expert. The pattern is documented. The routing is traceable. The timeline correspondence is demonstrable. Then we have something. Tell me what we have. We have evidence of coordinated interference in a legal proceeding, Rourke said, and her voice had changed the careful, measuring quality, replaced by something sharper, something that had been waiting for exactly this kind of ground to stand on. If we can demonstrate that Mujean's organization placed an operative inside your firm prior to these proceedings and used her to monitor and respond to your legal strategy, we are no longer talking about a contentious corporate divorce. We are talking about obstruction. We are potentially talking about federal exposure for the organization. Imani was quiet. Federal, she said. His legitimate business activities have been under a certain amount of quiet scrutiny for longer than you may know. I have a contact at the U.S. Attorney's office, not someone I involve lightly and not someone who does favors, but someone who understands when information has value beyond a civil proceeding. Rourke paused. I need to know if you're prepared to go that far. Question sat in the kitchen with her. She looked at the window. Manhattan was out there, doing its indifferent business. The same as always. The same as October. The same as every morning she'd stood in this apartment, measuring the distance between who she was and what she was willing to do. She thought about Everett, standing in his office lobby at 7 in the morning, facing two polite men who knew his coffee order and wanted him to understand the cost of his signature. She thought about Priya, 3 years of competence and small daily intimacies, the coffee order Priya always remembered, the way she anticipated scheduling conflicts, the particular reliability of her that Imani had interpreted as loyalty, and that had been, from the start, a different kind of attention entirely. She thought about Mujin, who had placed a person inside her firm 2 years before she walked out of Callaway's, which meant that whatever he'd told himself about their marriage in those final years, some operational part of him had already been treating her as a potential threat to be managed. That was the thing she couldn't set down. Not the surveillance, not the interference, not even Priya. The specific timeline 2 years before she knew anything was wrong. He had already begun preparing for her as an adversary. A sound like green wood splitting. He had stood in their kitchen and drunk the coffee she made and looked at her across the counter of their shared life, and somewhere underneath that, his world had been mapping her professional structure for weaknesses. She had thought she was the one who had been preparing in the dark. He had started earlier. Yes, she said, I'm prepared. All right. Rourke's voice was clipped now, moving fast. Don't touch Priya yet. Don't change her access. Don't alter her routine. Don't look at her differently when she walks in this morning. We need her in place for approximately 72 more hours while Jerome finalizes the documentation trail and I make a call I've been holding. You want me to work next to her for 3 more days. I want you to have the most ordinary Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of your professional life. Can you do that? Imani thought about the specific discipline required. The coffee order she'd have to take from Priya's hands and drink. The scheduling updates she'd have to receive and respond to, as if they were neutral information. The morning check-ins, the routine administrative conversations, the 10,000 small ordinary professional transactions that would now carry the knowledge of what they actually were. Yes, she said. I'll call you tonight, Rourke said. Stay off the regular lines. Imani got in the shower, changed, and arrived at the office at 8:53, slightly later than her usual 8:30, which she'd calculated as normal enough to not suggest disruption. Priya was already at her desk, reviewing the day's calendar on her screen with the focused attention she always brought to the first hour. Morning, Priya said without looking up. You have the Holloway call at 10, the structural review at 1, and Jerome Sills left a message on the main line saying he's confirmed your Thursday appointment. She looked up. Do you want me to add it to the calendar? No, Imani said, keeping her voice completely even. I'll manage Jerome directly. Everything else looks fine. She walked into her office and closed the door and stood behind it for exactly 4 seconds, her back against the wood, a sound like green wood splitting, looking at the room she'd designed and the windows she'd chosen, and the drafting table where she'd built 30 years of professional identity. Then she walked to her desk and opened the Hartwell file. She worked. By Wednesday evening, Rourke had made her call. She didn't tell Imani who specifically she'd spoken to, but she told her what had been communicated. There was existing interest, not in Imani's divorce proceedings, but in the organizational infrastructure of CO Meridian's New York operations. Jerome's documentation, the contact chain, the data export pattern, the timeline, connecting the placed operative to an organizational manager, was consistent with information the relevant office had been developing through separate channels. It didn't create a new investigation. It confirmed and advanced an existing one. Imani's divorce proceedings would continue on their own track. But the track was no longer the only track running. What does that mean for us? Imani said. She was in her car, parked 2 blocks from the office, engine off, because she'd needed air and movement and the walk hadn't been enough. It means Bae Suh is about to find out that his client's organizational exposure has become significantly more complex, Rourke said. And it means the conversation we're having with them about equity and name rights is going to happen in a context where Mujin has very strong reasons to make it end quickly and quietly. He'll know I went to them. He'll suspect it. He can't prove it. Danica. She looked at the street ahead of her, a hardware store, a dry cleaner, a woman in a green coat pushing a stroller over a crack in the sidewalk. He's going to know it was me, Imani. Rourke's voice was direct and unsparing. He placed a person inside your company for 3 years. He had men follow your business partner to his coffee shop. He's been reading your legal strategy since before you had one. A pause. Whatever he decides about what you've done, you need to ask yourself whether his opinion of your choices is still something you're managing for. She looked at the woman in the green coat, who had stopped to adjust something in the stroller, with the focused, unhurried attention of someone for whom this sidewalk, this stroller, this small engineering problem was the entire world right now. No, Imani said. It's not. Then let's finish this. Thursday arrived the way significant days always arrive, indistinguishable from ordinary ones until they're not. Imani was at her desk at 8:15 when Rourke called, and the sound of Rourke's voice in the first syllable of her name told her something had shifted. Besa called me at 7 this morning, Rourke said. He wants to meet. Today, not mediation, he said, informal discussion. Their office this afternoon. He said Mujin wants to be present. Imani's hand tightened slightly around the phone. Mujin himself, in person, which they haven't requested before. Which means the information reached them, and it reached them fast, and Mujin has decided the conversation needs to happen at a level above his attorneys. What time? 3 o'clock. I'll be with you, I know. She put the phone down and looked at her drafting table. She thought about sitting across from him again, not across a dinner table this time, not in the carefully arranged social theater of Calloway's, but in a conference room with attorneys present and the full documented weight of everything she'd built arrayed on her side of the argument. She thought about what his face would look like, whether the calculation would still be there, or whether the fracture she'd heard on the phone in January had spread. She worked until 2. Then she changed into the suit she'd brought to the office, that morning dark charcoal, structured, the kind of garment that communicated nothing, except that the person wearing it had decided exactly how much of herself to show, and she rode down with Rourke in a cab to Besu's office on Park Avenue. Conference room was on the 31st floor, and it had the museum-quality art and the floor-to-ceiling views she'd expected. The full visual vocabulary of a firm that wanted you to feel the architecture of power before anyone said a word. Bay himself was a compact Korean-American man in his late 50s with rimless glasses and the particular stillness of someone who had learned a long time ago that motion communicates uncertainty. His 2 associates flanked him with the practiced invisibility of people whose job is to document rather than participate. Mujin was already seated. He looked not diminished, exactly, because he was not a man who diminished easily. A sound like greenwood splitting and the organizational infrastructure that had built him would hold its shape regardless of what happened in this room. But he looked different from October, different from every version of him she'd observed since the anniversary dinner. He looked like a man who had revised his assessment of a situation and found the revision unpleasant. He looked at her when she walked in. She held the look for exactly as long as she chose to, then sat down. Rourke sat beside her. She opened her portfolio with open hurried efficiency of someone who has 1,000 and found it neither exciting nor intimidating. Bay spoke first. We appreciate you coming on short notice. We felt it was important to have a direct conversation given the, he paused, fitting the word carefully, the evolving complexity of the situation. We're happy to have direct conversations, Rourke said. We've been requesting them since December. Mujin said nothing yet. He was watching Imani, and she could feel the specific quality of his attention, not the bored, dismissive attention of the anniversary dinner, but something much more concentrated, the attention of a man doing rapid structural analysis. She looked back at him with the expression she'd developed in 13 years of negotiating with difficult clients, open, present, and completely unreadable. There are elements outside the legal proceedings, Bay said carefully, that we believe have introduced unnecessary complication into what should be a relatively straightforward matter. I agree completely, Rourke said. The introduction of organizational operatives into my client's business, for example, was an unnecessary complication. The room shifted. Not physically nobody moved, but the pressure in it changed. The way pressure changes in a structure when a load redistributes. Bey's expression remained professionally neutral. His associate's pens, Imani noticed, had both stopped moving. Mujin said Imani. It was the first word he'd spoken. He said it the way he'd said it on the January phone call, with the weight of someone for whom the word had once meant something specific, deploying it now as a different kind of instrument. Mujin, she said, same register, same weight, an exact return. This doesn't have to become something it doesn't need to be. I think we're past the point of deciding what it needs to be, she said. We're at the point of deciding how it ends. He leaned forward slightly. The movement was controlled, deliberate, not aggression, but emphasis. You know what you've put in motion. I know exactly what I've put in motion. Do you know what you put in motion 3 years ago, when you placed someone inside my company? The muscle along his jaw moved. Once. That's not something we're going to discuss in this room. Then you understand why I'm not interested in discussing what I did or didn't do in relation to it, she said. You made choices. I made mine. That's the symmetry of this situation. You're not in that world, he said. His voice had dropped slightly, gone quieter in the specific way that meant the temperature had risen rather than fallen. You don't understand what you've stirred up. I understand enough. She kept her voice level, kept her hands flat on the table, kept her breathing regular with the conscious effort of someone who had been practicing this exact discipline for months. I understand that your legitimate business operations have value to your organizational structure that goes beyond money. I understand that the architectural firm carrying my name has provided a certain category of professional credibility that you've found useful for the past 13 years. And I understand that the removal of that credibility from your accessible sphere is a problem that no organizational solution can fix, because it lives in the professional world, not yours. He stared at her. She stared back. My name comes off the firm, she said. Equity settles at the number our documentation supports, which is not 43%. The divorce finalizes on the timeline my attorney establishes. Those are the terms. Bey started to speak. Mujin raised one hand barely, a millimeter of movement, and Bey's stopped. And if I don't agree to those terms, Mujin said, then the information that's been shared with parties outside this room becomes more detailed, more specific, and more actionable. And you and your attorneys and your organizational managers can spend the next 18 months determining the precise cost of that. She paused. Or you can end this today, cleanly, and we both walk out of here with what belongs to us. The silence lasted long enough that Imani became aware of ambient sounds she hadn't registered before, a phone ringing somewhere down the hall, the low mechanical breath of the building's ventilation system, the very distant sound of Park Avenue 31 floors below. Mujin looked at her, not with anger. That had been the expression she'd braced for, had prepared responses to, had spent months building the structural capacity to withstand. What she saw instead was something that looked, in its most stripped-down form, like recognition. The specific recognition of someone who had fundamentally miscategorized a thing and is absorbing the full cost of that error. He looked at Bey. Some communication passed between them that didn't require words. Bey turned to Rourke. We'll need to discuss the specific equity figure your documentation supports. I'd like to see the full methodology. I'll have it to you by end of business today, Rourke said. And the name restructuring, Bey continued. The timeline. 60 days from signing, Rourke said. We're not extending that. Another look between Mujin and his attorney. Shorter this time. 60 days is aggressive, Bey said. 60 days is what it is, Rourke said. Mujin stood up. The movement was sudden enough that one of Bey's associates shifted in his chair. Mujin buttoned his jacket with 2 precise, unhurried movements and looked at Imani across the conference table. You built something real, he said. It wasn't an apology and it wasn't a concession. It was a statement of fact delivered by a man who had spent 13 years living adjacent to it without fully reckoning with its weight. She didn't thank him. She didn't soften the exchange with any of the social lubricant she'd spent a decade applying to his rougher edges in professional settings. I know, she said. He left the room. Bey and his associates remained, and what followed was 4 hours of the most exhaustive, clause by clause, provision by provision negotiation Imani had ever participated in, including every major contract she'd signed in 20 years of practice. Rourke was meticulous and unyielding in the way of someone who had prepared for every position the other side might occupy and had determined in advance exactly how far she would move on each one. Imani sat beside her and answered questions when asked and remained silent, when silence was the right instrument, and she watched the shape of the settlement emerge from the afternoon, the way buildings emerge from their drawings, slowly. Then suddenly, the idea becoming a thing with actual mass and dimension. The equity landed at 11%, not 43, not 35, not the split the difference 38 that Rourke had told her they'd been angling toward on the first day. 11%, which was the number their documentation actually supported when you removed the mythology and looked at the verified contribution record, the specific capital, the specific relationships, the specific operational involvement that could be demonstrated rather than claimed. Mujin's name came off the firm effective 60 days from signing. The divorce settlement terms were established on a separate track that Rourke finalized by phone with Bay's family law associate while Imani was still sitting in the conference room reviewing the business document language. By 7:15 in the evening, Baysu's conference room held only Imani, Rourke, and the remains of a coffee service that had been replenished twice and was now cold and largely untouched. The associates had gone. The documents were drafted, marked for signature pending review, and transmitted to both parties' offices. Rourke took her glasses off and set them on the table and rubbed the bridge of her nose with 2 fingers. That, she said, with the flat, spent satisfaction of someone who has run a very long distance and is not yet ready to call it finished, is what 11% looks like. Imani looked at the window. The city had gone dark while they were in the room. Park Avenue was bright below them, the vertical rivers of headlights and street lamps and lit office towers that made Manhattan look from above, like something that had organized itself by its own logic, without reference to any plan, purely through accumulated insistence. She thought about the Priya question, still unresolved, still sitting in the operational space of her firm, still showing up to work every morning and routing correspondence, and managing the schedule of a woman who now knew exactly what she was. Jerome had confirmed the documentation was complete. The question of what to do with it had been deliberately deferred until after today, because Rourke had been right that containing it was more valuable than acting on it prematurely. Now it was after today. Priya, she said. Rourke nodded. Jerome's documentation goes to her attorney tomorrow morning, along with a termination notice and the details of what we can demonstrate. She'll have the option of a clean exit or a very unclean one. Rourke paused. My expectation is she takes the clean exit and the IT contractor. Same package, same morning, same option. Imani looked at the window a moment longer. Sops scene. She thought about the 41 people who would come to work tomorrow morning without knowing that the ground beneath the firm had shifted completely today, that the name above their door was entering its final 60 days, that the woman who ran the place had spent the past 4 months dismantling one version of everything they worked inside so that a more accurate version could take its place. She would tell them. Not tomorrow, the signing had to happen first. The formal documents had to clear review, but soon, directly, in the specific terms they needed to understand. She owed them that. She'd always owed her people directness, and the places where she'd failed at it in the past 13 years had cost her in ways she was still accounting for. She picked up her bag from the chair beside her Danica. She looked at Rourke across the cleared conference table. Thank you. Rourke put his back on. Don't thank me until you've signed the final documents. I'm thanking you now anyway. Rourke almost smiled. The almost was visible for approximately 1 second before the professional register reasserted itself. Get some sleep. I'll have the documents in your review queue by 9 tomorrow morning. Imani rode the elevator down alone. The lobby of the building was marble and glass and evening light, populated with the end-of-day traffic of a Park Avenue office, tower lawyers and bankers and consultants moving toward the exit with the specific fatigue of people who had spent their hours doing something that mattered to the precise degree that it paid. She moved through them and pushed through the revolving door into the February air, which hit her face with a cold that felt, after 7 hours in a conference room, like something she'd earned. She stood on the sidewalk. She didn't hail a cab immediately. She stood there on Park Avenue at 7:22 in the evening in her charcoal suit with the city moving around her in every direction, and she breathed in the cold air and felt the specific weight of what the afternoon had been. She had walked into that room with 11 months of preparation, 41 folders of documentation, a federal implication she'd been willing to deploy and had deployed, and 13 years of her own professional record arrayed as evidence of the argument she was making. She had sat across from the man who had spent those 13 years adjacent to everything she built and had decided, somewhere in the middle of them, that she was a variable requiring management rather than a person deserving of his full attention. She had not screamed at him. She had not cried. She had sat at a conference table, and she had been, with complete and unsparing precision, exactly what she had always been, the most prepared person in the room. He had placed an operative inside her firm. She had placed the full weight of what he'd done inside a federal context that he would spend the next period of his life carefully managing. That was the trade. That was the symmetry she'd described to him across the table, and it was accurate, and she didn't feel victorious about it because victory implied a game, and she had never wanted to be in this game, and she was not going to romanticize the fact that she'd played it well. She hailed a cab. The driver pulled into traffic without speaking, and she sat in the back with her bag in her lap, and her hands folded on top of it, and watched Midtown scroll past the window, block by block, the lit windows of all the other lives being conducted at this hour, in buildings she could see from the street, the architectural vocabulary of a city that had been built, floor by floor, by people like her, and that would keep being built long after the specific negotiations of this specific night were history. Her phone lit up on her lap. A text from Everett Rourke's office called Marcus. He said things moved today. You okay? She looked at it for a moment. Then she typed, more than okay. I'll tell you everything Thursday. Go home. His response came back in 30 seconds, already there. Marcus made soup. There's enough for 3 if you need it. She stared at that for a long moment. She was going to be fine. Cab moved uptown through the dark, and the city burned around her the way it always burned, without permission, without pause, without the slightest interest in anyone's particular difficulty, and Imani Virel sat inside it and understood, a sound like green wood splitting with the specific clarity that only arrives after the hardest thing you've done, that the next thing she had to build was already waiting for her, and that she already knew exactly how to begin. The documents arrived in Imani's review queue at 8:53 the following morning, 17 minutes before Rourke's promised 9 o'clock, which told her that Rourke had been at her desk before 7, and that the 17 minutes were the product of a final read-through rather than any delay in preparation. Imani read every page. Not skimming reading, the way she read structural specifications on a critical project, word by word, clause by clause, understanding not just what each provision said, but what it meant in combination with the provisions beside it. She had a red pen in her hand, and she used it twice on minor language that needed tightening, and she photographed those pages and sent them to Rourke with annotations before 10 o'clock. Rourke called at 10:12. Both changes are acceptable. I'll have the final version by noon, and Besu's review. His associates went through it last night. He signed off at 7 this morning. Imani set down her pen. Mujin signed off. Mujin signed off. She absorbed that for a moment, the specific weight of it, the 11 months from October to this February morning, compressed into those 4 words. He had signed off. The man who had built an empire on the principle that he did not concede anything he had decided had looked at the documented evidence of what he actually owned and had made the calculation that she'd been counting on him making, that the cost of continuing was greater than the cost of releasing. Then we're ready, she said. Signing is scheduled for 2 o'clock at my office. Both parties present. I'll be there. She put the phone down and looked at her drafting table. The Hartwell Cultural Center drawings were spread across it. The steel fabrication issue Cassidy had flagged was resolved. The addendum drafted, the revised details clean and correct. Beyond the drawings, through the window, Midtown was doing its mid-morning business, in full February light that was finally, for the first time in weeks, doing something more than enduring. She had things to do before 2 o'clock. She walked out of her office and into the open studio floor, where 23 people were at their desks, in various states of focused work screens lit, trace paper layered over drawings. Someone arguing quietly with a contractor on the phone about a delivery date. The specific productive noise of a functioning architectural studio, which Imani had loved from the first day she'd occupied a space like this, and had never entirely stopped finding remarkable that this was a place where things got made, where ideas became drawings, and drawings became buildings, and buildings became the physical fact of the world. People moved through. She stood at the edge of the floor for a moment. Priya was at her desk near the entrance, head down, working. From this distance, in this light, she looked exactly like she always looked: efficient, focused, reliable. The sound like green complete that if Imani hadn't known what she knew, she would have seen exactly what she'd seen every morning for 3 years, a gifted administrator doing her job well. She walked to Priya's desk. Priya looked up. Morning. You have the contractor call at 11 and the... Clear my afternoon, Imani said. And then come into my office. A pause. Brief. Priya's expression didn't change, she was too trained for that, but something behind it shifted it. A micro-adjustment of internal calibration that Imani recognized as the particular recalibration of someone who has understood, suddenly and completely, that a situation has changed. Of course, Priya said. Imani walked back into her office and left the door open. She sat at her desk and folded her hands on top of it, and waited, looking at the window and the city beyond it, and she kept her breathing even, and her hands, because she had one more thing to do before 2 o'clock, and she needed to do it correctly. Priya came in 30 seconds later and closed the door behind her. She sat in the chair across from Imani's desk, the client chair, the one that had held developers and city officials and creative directors, and everyone who had ever come to this office to ask Imani Virel for something. She sat in it with the careful posture of someone who had decided to maintain composure as long as possible because it was the last form of control available. Imani looked at her. She thought about what to say. She'd composed various versions over the past 72 hours: confrontational, cold, legally precise, professionally neutral. She discarded all of them because none of them were honest, and dishonesty was not something she was willing to practice anymore, not even in the service of an efficient outcome. I know what you did, she said. I know when it started, and I know who you were working for, and I know the specific data you exported and the specific people you communicated with. My investigator has documented all of it. My attorney has it. Priya said nothing. I'm not going to ask you why, Imani said. I don't need to understand your reasons. I needed to understand the fact of it, and I do. She paused. What I want to tell you, and I'm telling you this because it's true, and not because it helps me in any practical way, is that you are genuinely talented. The work you did here was real work, done well. And I don't know how to separate the performance from the talent because I'm not sure you can, and that's not something I'm going to spend time trying to resolve. Priya's hands were in her lap. They were completely still, which cost her something. Imani could see the cost of it in the set of her shoulders. You'll receive a formal termination notice today, Imani continued. Your attorney will also receive documentation of the conduct that's grounds for the termination. You'll have the option of a clean exit, full professional confidentiality on our end, no pursuit of civil action. Your record here reflecting completion of service rather than cause. That option is available until 5 o'clock today. And if I don't take it, Priya said, her voice was steady. Not defiant, just steady, the voice of someone who had known this conversation was coming and had prepared for it. Then everything Jerome documented goes to the same federal contacts that already have other information about the organizational structure you were working inside. Imani let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. I don't want that for you. I'm telling you that honestly. But I also won't apologize for it if it becomes necessary. Priya looked at her hands. Then she looked up. You were a good person to work for, she said. I want you to know that she stopped. started again. It doesn't matter what I want you to know. No, Imani said quietly. It doesn't. Priya stood. She smoothed her jacket with both hands, a gesture so habitual and ordinary and human that it landed with unexpected force, the specific smallness of it against the largeness of what the conversation had been. I'll have my things cleared by noon, she said. Take the time you need, Imani said. Just be gone before the afternoon. Priya nodded once and left. Imani sat alone in her office for 4 minutes. She looked at the city. She looked at the Hartwell drawings on her draft table. She looked at the red pen hen she'd used that morning on the settlement documents, still sitting at the edge of her desk where she'd left it. Then she picked up her phone and called Jerome. It's done, she said when he answered. Priya will be out today. Send the documentation package to Rourke's office and archive everything else. And the IT contractor. Rourke's office handles that. You'll hear from her assistant this afternoon. Understood. A pause. Imani, for what it's worth, you handled that whole thing the right way. I handled it the only way I knew how, she said. I'm not sure that's the same thing. She hung up and went back to work. At 1:45, she rode the elevator down to the lobby and walked out into the February afternoon. The signing was 6 blocks away, and she walked them not because she needed the time or the air, but because she had always preferred to arrive at significant things on foot, under her own power, having covered the ground herself. Rourke's conference room held 4 people, Imani, Rourke Bey-Su, and a Bey-Su associate who was there to notarize. Mujin was not present. His absence had been communicated through Bey that morning. He had authorized Bey to sign on his behalf for the business agreement, and the divorce settlement required only attorney signatures at this stage. Imani had expected to feel something specific when she understood he wasn't coming. Relief, maybe, or a residual version of the old instinct to read his absence as another form of dismissal. She felt neither. She felt the clean, functional absence of feeling, which was different from numbness. Numbness is the suppression of something present. This was the genuine absence of an attachment that had already completed its dissolution long before the documents formalized it. She signed where Rourke indicated, 11 times. Her signature on 11 pages, each one precise and legible, her full name written the way she'd written it since she was 8 years old, and had decided she liked the particular architecture of those letters, the way Virel opened and closed. The vertical spine of the V carrying everything else. Bey signed for Mujin. The notary stamped and witnessed. Rourke collected the documents with the organized efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times and understood that ceremony is not what makes a thing real. That's it, Rourke said. She didn't say congratulations. She said, I'll have fully executed copies to you by 5. Imani shook Bey's hand firm brief, without warmth but without hostility, the handshake of 2 professionals who had been on opposing sides of something and were now standing on the same side of its completion. He met her eyes for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, but that contained, she thought, a measure of professional respect that had probably cost him something to feel. She walked back to her office. The afternoon was ordinary. She reviewed the Hartwell addendum. She took the contractor call she'd rescheduled. She signed off on a material specification for the Chicago Commission that had come in the previous month, a cultural foundation in the West Loop that had approached Virel Meridian specifically, had submitted a brief that read like it had been written with her work in mind, had offered terms that told her they understood what they were getting. She had said yes on the same day she received the offer, which was unusual for her. She typically took a week, read everything twice, looked for the problem hidden in the language. But this one had been clean, and she'd known it immediately, the way you know certain things before you've finished reading them. Everett called at 4. Rourke's office called, he said. Is it done? Signed at 2:15. A silence. Not long. Everett was not a man who used Tassicent for emotional processing. He used it for structural verification, checking that what he'd heard was consistent with what he understood. When do we tell the staff? Monday morning. Full staff meeting, 9 o'clock. I want everyone together. What do we tell them? The truth. The name is changing. The firm is not. The work continues. Everyone's position is secure. The new name reflects the actual principles of the organization. She paused. Everett. I'm sorry about January. The men at your coffee place. I should have. His voice was firm, but not unkind. You didn't put those men there. He did. I know. But you were in my professional orbit, and what happened to you was a consequence of my situation. And Imani. He said her name the way old collaborators say each other's names with the weight of shared work, shared arguments, shared creative failures and successes, all the accumulated evidence of having built something real together. Marcus made that soup. We ate it. It was fine. You're not responsible for managing the weather just because you know it's coming. She looked at her window. Thank you, Everett. Monday at 9. I'll bring the good coffee. She spent the rest of the afternoon working, and at 6:30 she closed her files, turned off her desk lamp, and stood in her darkened office for a moment before leaving, not from sentimentality, but from the specific practice she'd developed in 20 years of completing significant things, which was to stand briefly in the space where the work had happened and acknowledge that it was done before moving to the next thing. She took the elevator down. Felix was at the security desk for the evening shift. Good evening, Ms. Varel. Good evening, Felix. She paused at the desk. I wanted to tell you you'll start seeing some changes to the lobby signage over the next couple of months. The firm's name is being updated. New lettering, different configuration. I wanted you to know before it happens. Felix looked at her with the steady, observant attention of someone who had watched this lobby for 4 years and understood more about the life of the building than most people in it. Same firm, though. Same firm, she said. Better name. He nodded, satisfied. I'll keep an eye on the installation crew. Make sure they do it right. I knew I could count on you. She walked out into the evening. The month that followed the signing was the most operationally dense period Imani had experienced since the firm's 3rd year, when they'd had 4 projects in simultaneous construction phases, and she'd been managing everything from material to contractor scheduling conflicts with a team of 11 people and a calendar that left no margin for anything human. 60 days was the timeline for the name transition, and 60 days was not. When you factored in the legal filing requirements, the notification obligations, the client communications, the vendor and contractor updates, the digital and physical signage replacement, and the internal restructuring of the operating agreement that would formalize Everett's position as full equity partner. 60 days was aggressive the way Rourke had said a second, which meant it required the kind of focused execution Imani had built her entire career on. She ran it like a construction project. Work breakdown structure. Critical path identified. Responsibilities assigned with specific deliverables and deadlines. No task assumed complete without documented confirmation. She had always been better at building things than at stopping to assess what the building cost her, and she recognized this about herself clearly enough to set one non-negotiable in the project schedule every Friday afternoon, from 2 o'clock until she left the office, was blocked. No meetings, no calls, no deliverables due. 2 hours of unstructured time that she used variously for walking, for reading, for sitting at her kitchen window with a cup of tea, for drawing things that had no client and no purpose, except the pure mechanical pleasure of making marks that meant something to no one but her. It helped. The Monday morning staff meeting had gone the way she'd expected. Some anxiety, some questions, some relief from people who had quietly been carrying their own uncertainty about the firm's direction throughout the preceding months. She'd been direct about everything she could be direct about. The name was changing, because the name should have changed years ago. The principles were changing, because the firm's operational reality was being formalized into its legal structure. No positions were being eliminated. The work continued. The clients had been notified she'd written each client letter herself, personal and specific, and had received responses from 22 of the firm's 31 active clients within the first week, every one of them confirming continued engagement. One of those responses had come from the Holloway organization, not from a staff member, but from Marcus Holloway himself, in a handwritten note on his company letterhead that said, in its entirety, "We follow the work, not the letterhead." Looking forward to what comes next. She'd framed it. It was the only thing on the wall of her new apartment that wasn't architectural. The new apartment was in a building on Riverside Drive that she'd found in March. 6 weeks after the signing, when the penthouse on East 72nd had finally stopped being a place she could productively inhabit. The Riverside apartment was smaller, not dramatically, but meaningfully smaller, and the downsizing had been not a loss but an edit, the way good architecture edits itself, removing what doesn't serve the core purpose until what remains is more honest and more useful than what preceded it. She'd furnished it slowly, selecting each piece with the deliberate attention she'd spent 13 years, unable to fully apply to her own domestic environment because the domestic environment had belonged, in its deepest organizational logic, to someone else's sense of what a space should communicate. This space communicated her. The drafting table was in the corner by the largest window. Her books were organized the way she'd always wanted to organize them, by subject, rather than size. The architectural theory beside the structural engineering, beside the art history, beside the 6 novels she actually read and reread, rather than the 50 she'd accumulated for the purpose of looking well-read. The kitchen was simple and functional and contained exactly the equipment she used, and nothing that existed for display. The bedroom held her bed and her writing desk and the collection of composition notebooks, 11 volumes plus the current 12th, stacked in the order they'd been filled, which was not a sentimental arrangement but a structural one. Each volume a record of a period, the stack a visible account of the time spent thinking. Moo Jin did not contact her after the signing. She had expected him to, in some form, not with concession or apology, which were not instruments he used, but with the organizational equivalent of one final position statement, one more communication designed to establish that his departure from her life was on his terms rather than hers. It didn't come. Whether that was counsel from Bay, or the federal adjacency creating its own motivations for quiet, or simply Moo Jin's particular form of dignity, operating in a situation where none of his standard instruments applied, she didn't know. And she had stopped trying to read his motivations the way she'd stopped trying to read weather patterns. She was no longer standing in. Yerim moved into the East 72nd penthouse in April. Imani heard this through a mutual professional acquaintance who mentioned it in passing at an industry event, with the slightly uncertain look of someone unsure whether the information was news or not. Imani thanked her for mentioning it and moved on to the next conversation. She felt nothing particular about it, not the spike of jealousy she'd braced for during the early months, not the cold satisfaction of indifference performed for an audience. Just the genuine, unperformed quiet of someone who had fully vacated a space and therefore had no reaction to what now occupied it. Their story simply no longer included her. The Hartwell Cultural Center broke ground in April on a Wednesday morning with a ceremony that was smaller than developers had wanted and larger than Imani was comfortable with, which put it at exactly the right size. There was a rendering on display 6 feet wide, her design translated into a photorealistic image that showed the building's main facade catching afternoon light the way she'd intended, the material language reading exactly as she'd drawn it. A city council member gave a short speech. The developer spoke. Everett stood beside Imani during both speeches with his hands in his coat pockets, and the expression he wore at every groundbreaking, which was the expression of a man calculating whether foundation work was going to be done correctly and by whom. When it was her turn to speak, she kept it short. She talked about the community the building was designed to serve. She talked about the responsibility of making permanent things in a city that is always being remade. She did not talk about herself, because the building was not about her. The building was about the people who would move through it, years from now, in contexts she couldn't anticipate and wouldn't live to see all of. And that forward-casting anonymity was part of what she loved about the work. The way good architecture outlasts the specific circumstances of its creation and becomes simply a fact of the world that people take for granted. She thanked the team. She thanked Everett by name, specifically in public, and she saw him look briefly away in the way people look away when something direct and true has been said about them in a group setting and they're not sure how to hold it. The groundbreaking shovel was ceremonial, the blade painted gold, and it was absurdly heavy for a ceremonial object, and when she drove it into the prepared ground, she felt the resistance of actual earth and the specific grounding sensation of doing a physical thing that mattered, and that sensation was, in its uncomplicated directness, one of the best things she'd felt in months. The National Design Award ceremony happened in October. 1 year. Almost to the day from the anniversary dinner at Callaway's, not exactly. The calendar didn't align with that kind of narrative tidiness, but close enough that she noticed it when she looked at the date on the invitation and held the coincidence for a moment before setting it down as the irrelevance it was. The award was for the Ashford Community Cultural Center, project she'd completed 2 years earlier that had apparently been working its way through the award cycle's deliberation process for longer than she'd known. The notification had arrived in August, a letter, formal, understated in the way that significant professional recognitions tend to be understated, as though the institution granting them has learned that excessive ceremony in the notification diminishes the impact of the actual event. Read it twice, set it on her drafting table, and gone back to the drawing she'd been working on. She told Everett the following morning. He'd looked at her for a moment with the expression he used when she did something he found characteristically herself, proud and exasperated in roughly equal measure, and said, "You found out yesterday, and you're telling me today. I was working. You're always working. So are you. That's why the firm functions." He'd called Marcus from her office to tell him, because Everett processed significant news by telling Marcus immediately, and Imani processed it by waiting until the work was done. Neither of them was wrong about this. The ceremony was in a concert hall in Washington, D.C., and she'd traveled down the morning of with Everett and Zora Belaine, the young architect she'd hired 7 months earlier, whose work was already generating the specific kind of attention inside the firm that told Imani she was watching someone at the beginning of a significant career. Zora was 29, from Atlanta originally, with a particular combination of technical rigor and visual boldness that Imani had recognized in her own work at that age and had found, in the younger woman, both familiar and entirely her own. Zora had asked, on the train down, what it felt like to win something like this. Imani had thought about it. "It feels like confirmation," she said. "Not of something you didn't know, of something you knew and weren't sure the world was going to agree with." Zora had written that down in the small notebook she carried everywhere, which Imani had noticed without commenting on, because it was the right instinct and commentary would have made it self-conscious. The ceremony itself was the ceremony formal, longer than necessary, the specific institutional pacing of an industry gathering that knows it has a captive audience and uses the fact. She sat between Everett and Zora through 4 preceding awards and a keynote address that contained two ideas worth keeping, and 20 minutes of framing she'd have cut entirely. When her name was called, she stood. The walk to the stage was 30 feet, maybe 35, across a floor she didn't look down at, because looking down at floors, when you're walking somewhere significant, is a habit she'd broken at 32, when she'd understood that the posture of confidence is not a performance of confidence, but a precondition of it. She walked the 35 feet with her head level and her shoulders open, and the specific internal stillness of someone who has been preparing for this, not this ceremony, this moment, this award, but for the general category of this, for long enough that it now felt less like arrival and more like continuation. The stage lights were the standard theatrical assault of any formal venue, bright enough to flatten the first several rows of audience into a collective presence rather than distinguishable faces. She shook the hand of the Institute president, a tall woman in her 60s named Eleanor Park, who had sent Imani a personal note of congratulation 3 years ago, when she'd won a regional honor, a note Imani had kept and accepted the award. It was heavier than she'd expected, which made her briefly grateful, because the weight gave her hands something real to manage, and real things are easier to hold than symbolic ones. She looked out at the audience. She had prepared remarks 2 minutes, maybe 2.5, specific and direct and absent of the performative humility that she'd always found dishonest at these events. She delivered them exactly as she'd written them, without the nervous compression that sometimes collapses prepared remarks into something faster and less considered than their author intended. She talked about the building. She talked about the community it was built for. She talked about Everett by name, again. A sound like Greenwood splittings in the specific terms of his technical contribution to the project, the structural approach he'd developed for the main spanning element that had solved a problem she'd believed. For 2 weeks in the middle of the design phase, was going to require a fundamental rethinking of the entire program. She talked about the client team, the contractor, the fabricators who'd made the steel work look like it had grown there rather than been assembled. She did not talk about the year she'd had. She did not talk about Mujin, or the firm's name change, or the 11 months of legal battle that had preceded the award season. Those things were true, and they had been significant, but they were not what the building was, and the building was what the award was for, and she was not going to import the personal narrative into a space that belonged to the work. She thanked the Institute. She walked off the stage. Everett was standing at the bottom of the stage stairs, which was not where he'd been sitting. He'd moved. During her remarks, from the seat beside Zora to the bottom of the stage stairs, so that when she came down, he was the first person she saw. Splitting. He handed her the small bouquet he'd apparently been holding, which she hadn't seen him acquire, and which told her he'd planned this and that he'd planned it without telling her because he'd known she'd tell him not to. "Well done," he said. "You moved from your seat," she said. "I knew you'd come down this side. You didn't know that." "I know how you walk," he said, simply and without elaboration, which was completely true. After 13 years of shared professional life, he did know how she walked, knew which direction she naturally angled when approaching a choice of path, knew the specific sequence of her decision-making in physical space, the way she knew the particular structural logic he brought to every spanning problem. Marcus sends his love. He watched the live stream. You made him watch the live stream. He wanted to watch. There's a difference. She held the bouquet and the award and looked at him, this particular person, this long collaboration, this architect who had chosen 13 years ago to build something with her and had kept choosing it every year since. Through the good work and the difficult projects and the years when the firm was fighting for the next commission and the years when the commissions were more than they could manage and all the ordinary in between. Time that constitutes most of a professional life. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. Not just tonight." He looked briefly away, the same direction he'd looked at the groundbreaking, and then back. "Buy me a better dinner than what they're serving in there, and we'll call it even." Done. The dinner afterward was at a small restaurant in Georgetown that Zora had researched and selected with the specific preparedness of someone who understood that finding the right place to eat after a significant event is itself a form of professional contribution. The four of them, Imani, Everett, Zora, and a project architect, Damien, and a project bond named Name, who'd been on the Ashford team from the beginning, ate for 3 hours and talked about everything except the award, which was the correct way to behave after receiving something significant, because the award was already a fact, and facts don't require extended discussion, while the ongoing work always does. Damien was funny in the dry, timing-dependent way of someone who had spent years in construction site meetings where humor was the pressure valve, and he had developed an excellent instinct for when to deploy it. Zora argued with Everett about a material choice on the Chicago project, with the fearlessness of someone who has correctly determined that the person she's arguing with respects the argument more than the deference. Everett lost the argument, which he did with better grace than most people credited him for. Imani ate and drank and talked and laughed at the right moments, not the performed laughter of a social event, but the real, involuntary kind that happens when something genuinely lands. And she looked around the table at these specific people she'd chosen and who had chosen her, and thought about the question of what constitutes a life. Not in any abstract sense, but in the immediate, verifiable sense of what you can look around a table at 10:30 at night in a Georgetown restaurant and see. She drove back to New York the next morning. The train, actually, she'd always preferred the train on the Northeast Corridor, the way the landscape changed through the window in the specific sequence from D.C. to Philadelphia to Newark to Penn Station, the agricultural middle sections giving way to the industrial outer edges of the city, and then the city as itself, arriving not dramatically but incrementally, block by block, until you were inside it. She had the award in her bag. At a certain point in New Jersey, she took it out and held it in her lap and looked at it in the train window light, which was the flat, moving light of a clear October morning the same month, she thought again, as the beginning of all of this. Though the October light in October of this year was cleaner, somehow had more latitude in it, the way light looks when you're not filtering it through an accumulated weight of things you've been refusing to see. 1 year. From Callaway's to this train, from 8 place settings, to this particular morning 1 year that had been, in its total accounting, the most costly and the most clarifying year of her adult life. A year that had taken things from her she'd thought were permanent and had returned to her, in their place, a version of her own professional world that was structurally more honest than anything she'd inhabited before. She thought about Mujin, not with the frequency or the texture of grief that she'd anticipated in the early months. The anticipatory grief of a long marriage ending had turned out to be less than she'd feared. Because the actual marriage had been quietly ending for years before she'd acknowledged it, and most of the grieving had happened in the peripheral spaces of those years, in the small, unwitnessed moments of recognizing absence and choosing not to name it. By the time the legal process was complete, most of what needed to be felt had already been felt, in the only way she knew how to feel things alone, without ceremony, at her window, or her drafting table, or running the river path at dawn. She hoped, genuinely and without complexity, that he was managing his world with the competence she knew him to have. She hoped Urim was making him less lonely than she'd apparently made him, or at least differently lonely. She felt no jealousy, and no vindictiveness, and no residual tenderness, which was the specific emotional landscape she'd been aiming for, and had not been certain she'd reach. She reached it. Penn Station arrived the way it always arrived, abruptly. The train pulling into the underground dark of the terminal, the window going from New Jersey sky to concrete infrastructure in a transition that had always struck her as architecturally honest about what cities actually are. Organized darkness with light built into it rather than the other way around. She took the subway uptown rather than a cab because it was a Tuesday morning, and the crowds were the Tuesday morning crowds rather than the weekend crowds. And she had always thought most clearly in the particular anonymity of a subway car, where no one is looking at anyone else, and everyone is temporarily suspended between one place and another, belonging equally to neither. She got out at 96th and walked the 6 blocks to her building. The doorman, a young Dominican man named Carlos, who had started 3 months ago, and who she was beginning to know the way you begin to know people you see every day without appointment, held the door. "Morning, Ms. Varel." "Morning, Carlos. How's the baby?" His face did the thing faces do when someone asks about their child, with genuine rather than performed interest. "She's good. Keeps us up. But she's good. It gets better," Imani said. Slowly, but it does. She took the elevator up. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it, the morning light coming through the riverside window at the specific angle of October, which was lower and more lateral than summer light, and which she'd come to prefer precisely because it didn't flatten things, but showed them in relief. The way raking light on a building reveals surface texture that direct light obscures. The drafting table, the books, the kitchen, with its reasonable equipment. The writing desk in the corner of the bedroom, with the 12 composition notebooks, stacked in their sequence. She set her bag down. She took out the award and carried it to the drafting table, and set it beside the current drawings for the Chicago project, the West Loop Cultural Foundation, the commission that had arrived clean and clear, and that was a sound she would spin, now that she was working into its middle stages, turning out to be one of the most structurally interesting problems she'd worked on in a decade. The site constraints generating a building logic that she'd initially resisted and had come to understand was exactly right. She stood at the table for a moment, looking at the drawings and the award and the October light coming through the window. She thought about the version of herself that had walked into Callaway's 1 year ago, the woman in the midnight blue dress who had already known and had still somehow needed to sit at that table and have it confirmed in the most specific and unnecessary terms, as though the 13 years of accumulated evidence hadn't been sufficient and she'd needed the full tableau, the 8 place settings, the polished stranger in the chair that should have been empty, The family that had already made its accommodation to a future that didn't include her. She understood. She understood now that she'd needed it, not because the evidence was insufficient, but because she had loved the marriage she'd believed she was in, the specific idea of it, the version of Mujin she'd married and had slowly lost, without fully registering each individual loss. She'd needed the tableau, the way certain structures need a final load test, not because the engineering is in doubt, but because you cannot fully accept a result until it's been demonstrated at full scale. The tableau had demonstrated it at full scale. She had stood up from that table, and she had not looked back. Not in the emotional sense that phrase implies, not with the telescoping backward gaze of someone who is still measuring their present against a past they're reluctant to release. She had looked forward with the specific attention she gave to every project from its beginning, which was the attention of someone who understood that the most important thing about any structure is not what it replaces, but what it becomes. Betrayal and Quad Architecture. The name would go up on the Midtown building this week. She'd scheduled the installation for Thursday. Had selected the typeface herself, after going through 11 options, with a graphic designer, who had the useful quality of understanding that she didn't want to be convinced. She wanted to be shown options and left to decide. The final choice was clean and direct, the letters weighted but not heavy, the spacing deliberate legible from the street, at normal walking speed, which was the only criterion that mattered to her, practically. Because a sign that requires you to stop and look is a sign that is doing more work than a sign should do. She had not defeated Mujin. That framing had never been accurate, though she understood why the people who'd watched the process from outside tended toward it. It was narratively satisfying. The woman who outmaneuvered the crime boss organized against the organizational. But the truth was less dramatic and more actual. She had not defeated him because he had never been her primary opponent. Splitting. Her primary opponent had been the version of herself that had gradually learned to make herself smaller in order to occupy the same space as someone who was always expanding. That version, the one who made excuses, who measured her professional achievements against their usefulness to his world, who had stayed past the point where staying made sense, because leaving required confronting. What the staying had cost, that was the thing she'd been fighting. And it was a harder fight than any legal proceeding because it didn't happen in documents and conference rooms. It happened in the 2 seconds at 3 in the morning when you're awake and you look at the person beside you and you know and you choose again not to know. She had stopped choosing not to know. That was the whole of it. The legal strategy, the documentation, the Rourke partnership, the federal implication, the 60 days of name transition, the restructuring, the new apartment, the award on the drafting table, all of it was the consequence of that single internal act, repeated over 11 months, of refusing to unknow what she'd come to know. She sat down at the drafting table. She pulled the Chicago drawings toward her, the West Loop Cultural Foundation, the problem she'd been living with for 4 months, and that was now beginning to show her its own logic in the way buildings do. When you've sat with them long enough, not yielding to what you want, but demonstrating what they are. The site and the program and the structural system converging into something that couldn't have been any other shape. She picked up a pencil. Outside, the Riverside Drive traffic moved in its morning rhythm, the sound of it reaching her the way ambient sound reaches you through a window. You've chosen to live with open not as intrusion but as presence, the city doing its continuous, indifferent, inexhaustible work outside the space where her particular work was happening. She made a mark on the drawing, then another. The light moved across the table the way October light moves slowly at that low lateral angle, showing her the surface of everything it touched in the specific relief of a season that does not flatter, but illuminates. She worked, and the morning opened around her the way mornings do when you are finally, completely, without remainder, exactly where you belong.